Hello, and welcome to today's General Counsel Institute's webinar series. Before I kick off today's webinar, I'd like to address a few housekeeping items. Regarding CELI credits, please be sure to fill out the survey as well as respond to the pop-up check-ins. We will apply for CELI credit to each state identified after the completion of the webinar. Unfortunately, we aren't able to offer credits for South Carolina or Pennsylvania at this time. CELI credit is only available for this live day and not on demand. The survey can be answered at any time through the survey icon at the bottom of your screen, or it will pop up at the end of the webinar. I also wanted to bring to your attention the resource icon at the bottom of your screen. Here is where you'll be able to download the deck, as well as additional materials that may be of interest to you. Also, you can download a copy of the Corporate Investigations Report that is the topic of this webinar by using the link you'll find on the questions slide of the PowerPoint deck. And now, it's my pleasure to introduce today's webinar, Corporate Investigations, What the Pros Think, Key Insights from the H5 Corporate Investigations Survey, presented by today's General Counsel Institute and H5. Our distinguished speakers are TracyAnn Eggen, e-discovery specialist from Dignity Health, Sheila Mackay, Managing Director of e-discovery for H5, and Karla Wehbe, Director, Legal and Compliance Business Solutions, H5. And now, I'd like to pass it off to Sheila. Sheila?
Thank you, Jen. Hi, my name is Sheila Mackay, Managing Director at H5, focused on e-discovery and compliance. For those of you listening who are not familiar with H5, we work with companies and their law firms to provide technology, advanced analytics, and human expertise to identify and classify data in litigation and investigations, as well as compliance and information governance use cases. I'm happy to have here with me today TracyAnn Eggen. She's the Senior e-discovery Specialist that manages the day-to-day operations enterprise-wide for investigations and litigation for Common Spirit Health, formerly known as Dignity Health, here in San Francisco. During her over 4-year tenure with Dignity Health, she has championed the kickoff of their department overseeing the Center of Excellence for Legal Discovery and Investigations. Also here with me today, Karla Wehbe. She's H5's Director of Business Solutions for Legal and Compliance. Karla worked for the largest construction company in the United States for 15 years before joining H5. She developed the company's e-discovery program, and she brings this experience to today's webinar. Today's agenda will cover a brief overview of the survey we conducted, and we'll leave the majority of the time to discuss the trends and the key findings from the survey. Disclaimer, the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the speakers and do not reflect their employers. So before we get started, TracyAnn, what is your experience with corporate investigations?
Well, in my position, we support all the authorized investigators from HR, compliance, risk, CISO, cybersecurity sort of investigations from a data perspective, as well as defining processes. So in my position and role, I oversee, or our team oversees, basically any type of investigation that comes into a corporate environment.
Karla, anything to add there?
No, I mean, in my prior experience in-house, for 15 years, I had the opportunity to experience firsthand some of the complexities and sensitivities around investigations, corporate investigations, and how much it's a core part of the legal and compliance function. And so I think I'm looking forward to discussing these topics today.
Okay, and why do you think it's a pertinent topic today?
Well, I think investigations are increasing, and there are challenges within the corporate structure on how to oversee those investigations and how to deliver value in time-sensitive deadlines to the stakeholders so that key decisions can be made on risk assessment, next steps, and how, if it's a cyber-related, how you're going to protect your environment. And if there's anything that's going to impact business operations, this is critical for a corporation.
I certainly saw that play out in the survey. So H5 decided to take a deeper dive into this complex topic to examine the people who are responsible for investigations and their opinions about the trends. We also wanted to look at the differences among categories of investigations, such as TracyAnn just mentioned, cyber or due diligence, employee workplace, regulatory and governmental, and how those might vary across companies of different sizes and in different industries. So on that note, over 300 people responded to the survey, representing 10 different industries. There were companies of various sizes and revenues, different legal departments ranging from 1 person to 100 people. 85 of the respondents were from the U.S. and 15 from outside the U.S., which I think gives an interesting perspective. The survey was conducted between July and August 2019, and H5 worked with Above the Law on the field survey targeting those on the front lines of investigations and those involved in managing in the strategy, whose roles it is to select and allocate resources to respond to investigations. So with that background, we'll go ahead and dive into the results.
So this is Karla. There are different types of investigations that come with different risks. So the respondents were asked about what they believe are the most common investigation types. And you'll see that 43% said that the most common type was employee and workplace investigation. So, claims around harassment, theft, or discrimination, for example. The second most common type identified was the regulatory government investigations. 24% thought it was, should rank high. And there also the most common types can be found are different among industries. So employee and workplace investigations are at front of mind for technology, healthcare, consumer product companies, whereas, for example, finance and banking see regulatory and government investigations as the most common type. So the second perspective was we asked, what are the common investigation triggers? And you could probably put them in 2 buckets. 57% of respondents identified triggers, that come from a complaint. It could be a private or public complaint by a consumer, employee, or competitor. 45% of respondents thought that was one of the triggers, the most common triggers. It could also be through whistleblower action. 12% experienced that as a trigger. The second category are really 43% of responders are seeing investigation triggers that are initiated because of internal programs and processes that are designed to establish corporate compliance. So, for example, 16% identified routine internal audits as a trigger. 14% identified proactive monitoring of network traffic. 7% an anonymous tip via a corporate hotline, for example. Now, the main concerns associated with these investigations are, vary by investigation type. The top concern is a reputational concern, reputational damage, and you see that is showing up for workplace investigations as well as white-collar investigations, both at 43%. The second category of concerns would be related to the cost of investigations. And primarily, people see the potential cost of damages or fines as one of the main concerns, especially with regard to regulatory investigations. And overall, larger legal departments and corporations see that as a top concern. But there are other cost concerns like the potential disruption to the business that would arise from a cyber security investigation or third-party investigation. Over 30% see that as a main concern. And lastly, the cost of investigation themselves, they're not small, is certainly related to due diligence investigations. So, you can see that certain concerns are associated with certain types of investigation. That's not to say that there isn't more than one risk or concern associated with a type of investigation.
So with these different types of investigations, what issues might one face? PA?
You know, I think that there's a number of issues depending on what type of investigation. I would say that a company has invested in training. What department has the authorized investigator or team that's going to have oversight? Where the information and how easily it can be either collected or reviewed, whether that's inline and you have technology behind the firewall. I think that the access to that information, the size of the information, and really the timeline that you need to have some kind of solid reporting with integrity that you can deliver back to those stakeholders. And then the one thing is who are the actors and subjects of those investigations? And if it's a stealth investigation, can you really deliver value on where information resides in your corporate, and can you also deliver value on where there's an absence of information, whether you're using cyber tools and where communications may be taken offline.
So do these results resonate with both of you based on your experience in corporations?
I would say that, yeah, the employee investigations, they definitely resonate. I would say that employee investigations at the initial get-go and training people to eliminate bias when they're the authorized investigator are definitely the escalation point and the challenges within the environment of how people are relating to each other, how they resolve disputes, and do we have trained de-escalation strategies to get to those conflicts beforehand.
Yes, I think actually the different types of investigations, in my experience, are managed by different teams. And so, finding a commonality, finding escalation points, communication points are very important. Also, the complexity grows when you're dealing with a global corporation. There's, the issues of language and cultural barriers that present themselves. There's the issue of time, being able, not being in the same time zone. All these are, seem small, but they have a great impact on the results. But also different, a decentralized approach where you have a corporate team, you have maybe teams embedded within the functions or the projects, etc. So a lot of complexity there and sensitivity.
Okay. Moving on to the next set of results.
Yeah. So one of the findings, the key findings, I think, of this survey is that respondents see that investigations are on the rise. So they were asked, how many they see, how many investigations per year they see, and nearly half of the respondents said their company faced over 50 investigations per year. Naturally, the larger the corporation, the growing number of investigations. For corporations over 100 employees, they see over 250 investigations triggered. On the other hand, 53% of respondents reported less than 50 potential investigations actually triggered per year. In the non-US countries, they indicate fewer number of investigations overall. Now, the second aspect is that investigations are expected to increase. 63% of respondents said they would see an increase over the next 3 years. And notably, actually, the non-US participants said, 72% of non-US participants said that they see an increase. In addition to the increase in volume, we asked them, do they see, investigations grow from small to large, and how frequent is that? And so, respondents said that they see it less than 10% of investigations moving from small to large. This expansion in size of investigation could be that the scope of the investigation may change, but also it could be that there are related investigations or litigation that arises as well.
So TracyAnn, what are some of the factors contributing to the increase in investigations that we saw from these results?
Well, I think that you can't take away the human aspect of employees. There's, a general uncertainty, whether it's societal at a national or global sort of level, or if you're talking about the difference in companies. The workplace isn't where someone goes and works for 20 years and, there's a lot of competition. I think that there has been a decrease in mentorship programs and just career progression for people. There seems to be a very busy and fast-paced work environment where maybe the recognition for excellence isn't always there, and that there is change in leadership quite frequently, depending on reorganizations, mergers, acquisitions, and I think that that also increases it. And then, just for the financial gain that we are now facing, that financial times also have a bearing on that. So I think that the overall health for employees to feel sound in their positions, that they also are in support of the leader and feel like they're part of a culture and environment is definitely one of the reasons why we're seeing an increase in investigations.
Yeah, I think for all types of investigations, there appears to be trends kind of indicating that they're on the rise. For example, regulatory events are rising. There's a Thomson Reuters report that says that displays and shows that they're now tracking 1,000 regulatory bodies from which they capture 57,000 regulatory alerts. That's about 220 a day. So it's kind of, there's a lot of agencies involved.
And on Karla's point, this is really important. A lot of companies have onboarded very sophisticated cyber tools. So investigations are going to escalate based on that factor because before you couldn't see them. So the number of incidents, where are the false hits, how you tweak those different technologies is really going to impact until your system is really sound and mature in a way that you're targeting real investigations that require remediation. So I think technology is also, in some cases, increasing the number of investigations, and so we're seeing an increase in the percentages for the results of the study.
That's an interesting point, TracyAnn, because we saw that in one of the survey results about the amount of proactive monitoring that's going on, which, to your point, is exposing more things to be investigated than maybe we had before we had those kinds of tools. So what's the impact of these additional investigations on corporations?
I think there's an impact on how it's going to be handled, whether you're making an investment internally in a team and you're training out your teams, and how you can do this efficiently, where you're going to spend your upfront costs and investments so that as you can see the rewards or return on your investment later, 2, 3, 4 years down the line. I think this is really important, and I think those costs and how to manage that spend is really developing those type of relationships where, as Karla has mentioned, that you have very efficient decision trees, you have processes that are there, and training that's going to help the overall cost, and that you are investing in internal structures and teams so that you can retain that historical knowledge.
I think if the pressure is going to be turned up. If you have, for example, the SEC investing $183 million into their whistleblower program, and they were reporting in 2018 that 5,000 people came forward. When they started this, it was only 300. So more pressure there for whistleblower complaints. There's obviously the rise of cyber, and that's a lot of energy in corporations are focused on that. There's been a steady increase on workplace investigations as well. So they're seeing, there was an HR survey that showed that harassment claims were growing by 42%, discrimination complaints by 23%, other workplace misconduct 35%. So you can see that the pressures from the outside, TracyAnn, you were mentioning kind of internally how we're We're more capable now of identifying areas of risk from the outside. This pressure is mounting as well. So that means there's a pressure on internal resources that is felt. I think for investigation types that are kind of more frequent, where the volume is high, people come up with processes that are, become repeatable. But it's often the ones that catch you by surprise that start to drain your resources, in my experience, especially if they're high-stake types of investigations.
And regulatory is certainly high-stake investigations. Anytime there is a governmental body that you have a duty to turn over information that and sensitive business information on how you're doing that, when you have whistleblower complaints, internally, how you are going to support that from that. It's very challenging to support any type of turning over, and there is sort of this culture of protectionism of your company. Even if you initially assess that there isn't value in that complaint, it is extremely time consuming, and it requires a lot of resources that you may not have internally.
You can see how it could impact budgets in two ways: budgets for internal resources, as well as budgets for when an investigation happens and grows and expands and becomes something that includes a third party, outside counsel, whatever the case may be.
And there's no predictability,
right?
Because you have no idea. It's sort of like someone saying, what's your litigation budget going to be for this year? And, you go to the crystal ball and make a decision on whether or not you're going to get 400 lawsuits. So there's a lot of that unpredictability that you really need people driving business intelligence and metrics from an internal standpoint.
So speaking of spend and costs, our next topic.
Yeah, so respondents were asked how much their company spent on corporate investigations in the last 12 months. So 44% of respondents said they spend under $1 million on corporate investigations. 30% spent over $1 million, and 17% say they spent over $6 million. Now, for the companies with revenue over $100 billion, they were reporting a spend of over $10 million. The other interesting metric is actually that 27% didn't know the overall amount their company spent, which I think just shows perhaps sometimes how difficult it is to quantify overall the cost impact of investigations. Now, notably, the non-U.S. companies report a higher spend. 21% reported spending over $10 million. If you put this side by side with the fact that they're reporting fewer investigations, you may conclude that they're spending more money on investigations.
I thought that was very interesting.
Well, I think from a corporate standpoint, it's different when you have only your tracking spend on investigations is really siloed because it can cross over different departments and different personnel. So there's a number of different factors in those costs, and that's not usually within the metrics or within the budget reporting in a corporation level.
Interesting.
The areas of spend. So where are they spending this money? This was a multi-answer question. 86% identified outside counsel costs as the main area, followed by 59% saying the spend was on analytics technology, perhaps signaling a greater reliance on technology, as you were indicating, TracyAnn, and 53% of the spend going to e-discovery providers.
So as we see the investigations on the rise, and that's going to impact spend as we've been discussing, what are some of the ways to manage costs?
Well, I think that you still have to have a hybrid approach to that. I think with investigations on the rise, you really need to put the investment up early into key personnel and departments and build out an investigative unit that has oversight either on the data and the process, and then also when you diverge, like you were saying, Karla, from that process just based on the facts of that information, how that's going to be handled on decisions that are going to be made. I think if you're going to be strictly outsourcing investigations without leveraging your internal personnel who do have the historical retention, understand the players in those investigations, they understand department, facility, local, regional, national sort of relationships on investigations. I think these are all really important to be asking very substantive questions and also supporting outside counsel who serve as the lead of providing legal strategy and risk to an organization on where they stand in these investigations and what kind of offer and compromise is going to be ultimately tendered if that comes to those situations. So I still think in decreasing that you have to have an internal team. You need to build relationships with third parties, and those vendors become, you gain a cadence with them where they understand expectations, how you work together, where they need to go, how those investigations are run, and that all ultimately decreases that. You see an overall satisfaction with your outside partners, like outside law firms, that feel like they are receiving the information to be sound in their decision making.
Yeah, I think basically, investigations tend to put you in reactive mode. And so when you're in reactive mode, you're spending more. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's a process that you develop over time where you slowly move from, being completely reactive to having systems and a more proactive approach, perhaps. So one way to do that is simply to have your team at the ready, kind of like a crisis management approach. If something happens, what do I do? Who do I call? And do they know what is going to be asked of them? The second step, as you have this team on the ready and they're working with you, is they get to know your process well, and then it becomes easier over time. And they can move the process faster because ultimately, connected to cost is speed, and speed is important in investigations. So you also want to find methodologies that allow you to achieve your fact-finding, so that you can really, truly scope out and understand what your true risks are as quickly as possible. And so that's another, so knowing the people, understanding the boundaries of your technology. And I would say also understanding the areas that you need to watch out for in your process, that you should double check if you're dealing with a high-stake case. Sometimes international data collections are more difficult than collections in the U.S. If that's the case, you have a high-stake investigation, just keep a closer eye in that area as well. Make sure that your international collections are timely. Identify, teams that can help you with that, etc. So I think it's a process of moving to a more proactive approach.
And just to sort of add on to that, with investigations, you never know where or if nefarious actors lie. And sometimes you can be in the middle of an investigation when something like this transpires. So when you're talking about collection methodology, do you take a forensic acquisition of an image of somebody and how those interviews are, and also the communication, because a lot of times it's very, siloed or in compartments on how people are communicating, and the people who are there with the data or who are in charge of preserving that information so that there can be decisions and there can be review that are made are not always kept into the day-to-day or the updates of where that investigation is headed.
So we had a question from the audience I thought I would interject here, which is, has technology helped contain or reduce costs associated with responding to investigations? So I would say maybe outside of the technology you were talking about earlier, TracyAnn.
I think technology, probably once it's implemented effectively and it has some time to mature, is the cornerstone for decreasing spend for investigations.
So that would be technology both behind the firewall and not behind the firewall?
Correct.
Yeah, I think that technologies behind the firewall over time will have a greater impact on reducing spend.
Okay. So moving to the next topic, Karla, who manages investigations?
Yes. So overall, it's an in-house affair, managing investigations.
Seems to be a theme.
Yeah. 28% of respondents indicate that it's their in-house legal team that manages the process. 19% say it's their compliance department that manages it. And only 3% say it's outside counsel. And of course, 39% are saying it depends, obviously, on the investigation and the project, and that makes a lot of sense given the fact that you have different teams managing different types of investigations. So what is the reporting structure of those teams? 44% are seeing, before that I should say that 64% of respondents say they have a department or team that handles investigations, and that 44% of these teams report directly to the legal department. This appears to be true for larger corporations especially. 27% report into compliance. 21% report to the C-suite or the board, 8%. So for the people who say that these teams report to the C-suite or the board, it tends to be the smaller organizations, actually.
That makes sense. Let me go back to that slide there. So what are some of the best strategies for managing investigations?
I think that from the managing investigations, it really depends on if you've developed authorized investigators and teams, and are those teams trained? Do they have that sorts of sensitivities and understanding to manage them effectively? I think that as you start to look at managing those investigations as far as employee, where it's just a continual cycle, you might have a lot of employee investigations, like Karla was saying. Those are a very repeatable process. I will say that if you don't have that training up front and you don't have designated people that understand who they need to go to, what reporting call and decisions that you're making on those, it can cause investigations to be quite costly to the organization as a whole. And so I think you have to partner with your compliance professionals who know that space. You have to partner with risk. Where does legal really need to be involved, and do they really need oversight on HR, or does HR need to be trained of when to tender things so that they can invoke the attorney-client privilege at that point? So there's a lot of different depending on the size of the organization, that you have to take into time on what team should be. But I do think that it is a partnership with many different departments, with key strategic personnel that only handle investigations. It's not for, the entry-level person or the mid-range manager who are already taxed with resources, but somebody who is designated within that department to partner.
Is it common for there to be a designated person on a team or in a department?
I guess it would depend. I would say that in a lot of different organizations, it might be by default. That person just has a skill in that art, and not everybody has sort of an investigation sort of mind in order to move them along with consistency and standardization. I mean, one of the things when investigations then go to some type of litigation, that is generally, some of that investigation file is not attorney-client privilege. So do you have things along the way that you know that you have standard processes? Because one of the things is that plaintiff attorneys love to point out the inconsistencies in which you conducted investigations as being for biased or discriminatory practices, or what at the end of the that investigation, that there is a difference in the resolution for those investigations. So,
yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things on that front. First, the skill set required for investigations. Obviously, there's the skill of being able to handle and navigate very complex relationships, very sensitive topics. So that tends to be people with more experience that are needed there. Also, technical resources seem to be a new skill set. Of course, with cyber, you need that. Internal audit teams, querying data, to see some patterns in behavior. So there's, the emergence of these new skill sets. And then, of course, the legal skill set, lawyers, to be able to, direct the types of investigations that require legal oversight. So being able to identify these different skill sets and find them is important to managing investigations really well. I think secondly, it's really establishing a process to be able to determine kind of the critical nature, to classify investigations and identify those that are more critical than others. And that's also a factor of cost. It's how you manage costs, because if you label all your investigations as critical, then you're spending more money. So you kind of learn over time how to navigate that. So if you developed a kind of a roles and responsibilities and a process around that, so that the teams know, for example, what process they need to go through if it needs to be escalated to legal. If HR is kind of sees that a particular investigation should be handled differently. That's number one. Clarifying often with the business how to manage investigations. What may happen is when the business receives this inquiry, they may be very eager to be forthcoming, and they may conduct the investigation in a way that would not be necessarily defensible, or may create some new liabilities that we hadn't expected. So establishing that entire process and spelling it out is a good idea, so people know where to go and who to talk to. Because, like TracyAnn said, there are multiple silos sometimes that you need to bridge.
And that's got to be challenging. You've got multiple silos, you have different teams, you have different qualifications, different expertise. That must be tricky to manage within a corporation.
Well, it is tricky, but I think there's also one point that even anybody that's in this field, or has a position in a company, or even from a law firm, is that sort of post-analysis for investigations. Where have we done things really well? What are the results that we're driving? Where can we mature those processes? Where are we see some vulnerabilities in our standard operating procedures, or if we have an enterprise policy where we need to revise or we need to re-educate. So I think once the investigation's over and there's resolution, people sort of have this sigh of relief, but they're not looking at what you do a post-analysis on certain subject matter investigations, so you can make some determinations on where you can continually have that training and education that are going to reduce costs over time for your spend as an organization.
Well, that's true. Using that post-analysis to inform your more proactive approach. The best way to handle investigations is to reduce the need, reduce the occurrence, right, and the bad behavior.
Well, and it's the resocialization. If you have a policy out there and you take a survey or you have multiple investigations, and you're understanding that the people that are are part of or subject to that investigation do not even have a conceptual understanding of that policy, but also don't have a mastery, and that's a policy that applies to them over their operations, then you can start to see where some of these things open up a multitude of investigations.
Okay, thank you. So moving along, Karla, I'll hand it back to you on managing ESI.
Yeah, so one of the key aspects of managing ESI is data preservation and collection. So the majority of respondents indicated that over 25% of the investigations involve preservation. In that group, 29% report actually that 50 to 75% of their investigations require preservation. On the other hand, there are many that also say that their investigations require less than 25% of preservation efforts. So this may be interpreted in the light of some non-legal investigations not requiring preservation. I think that's one possible conclusion. So we also asked which types of investigations generate the most data, ESI, and respondents identified regulatory government investigations as generating the most ESI, which was probably predictable. The second type are employee and workplace investigations at 31%. In terms of the volume of data collected, 42% of respondents indicate they collect less than 100 gigabytes, 22% less than 500 gigabytes, 23% of respondents between 500 and 1 terabyte, and 13% over a terabyte. So it varies, broadly.
So TracyAnn, does that resonate, those stats there, does that sort of resonate with your experience?
Well, with data proliferation and with the absence of retention and destruction policies and what you really need for business operations, yes. I also think that when you have internal teams that are dealing with your information, delivering back to metrics of where potentially responsive information exists, depending on the target, whether it's email, whether it's, on, saved documents. I also think that there is also an expansive way of how we're collaborating. We have an escalation and social collaboration tools, unstructured content on how we communicate. Instant messenger used to be just for like a quick question while somebody was in a meeting or on a telephone to move that project forward. And so those were being used not standard in everyday practice, and now they are. So I think that it really aligns with how we are managing our data and the proliferation of all the tools that we're using. And when investigations come into play, where can we as a company or people who are in charge of them be able to say that, 75% of our information responding to investigations that are HR related are contained in email. And so going to the device and collecting that information, we only have a 0.01% of information that may be contained on the device because that is not the use case for that particular investigation. Right. So it's really important at that point. And then who's collecting the investigation, the data for the investigation. So I think that all of this aligns with this growing landscape, and it's a huge challenge for corporations to determine how they're going to process that type of information, how they're going to make it useful, how they're going to get to the fact pattern and where they need to go with that investigation in a timely way.
Yeah, I think preservation is one of the ways that you can increase your liability on cases. So it's a very important process to get right and something you do over time. You learn over time. That's what I experienced. And making sure that data does, you're securing the evidence you need can be quite a challenge. I think.
And because of relationships that people have, you know, they know the local IT person or they know the regional IT director, and so they want something that they have information instead of everybody being understanding what the workflow is for that type of investigation. That person, you know, does just a straight copy and provides information that may not be authorized later on, and that information isn't preserved. That person terminates. There's no reason to keep that information. You don't need it for business continuity. You were the investigation team, or because you don't have a process, is not informed that there's even was an active investigation that may be in an anticipation claim later on, and you have no purpose for legal preservation. And so a lot of times these actions can take a year or two to be in the forefront to the key stakeholders who have ownership over that process, and that information is gone. And they can point to that there was an underlying investigation that wasn't managed properly, and so then you're in a position where you maybe had a duty to preserve. And then, to your point, there's over-preservation. So there's always these sort of delicate balances that are being made, and most of us in the preservation realm learn through experience.
You can see how challenging that would be, too. Everything you just said, TracyAnn, magnified in a global corporation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think actually the collections process, you know, basically there are different groups perhaps, you know, needing to preserve and collect. And the collection process, in my experience, initially was done more in silo form, and slowly there was more of a convergence, and the different teams were beginning to adopt similar methodologies, similar tools as well. And something to think about in that process, and why that's a good thing that there's a convergence, is imagine that there is an investigation that starts, you know, in the compliance realm, but shows up later in the litigation world, and, you know, being able to bridge what was done before in, you know, in the compliance realm with the litigation, and kind of having continuity with the data is quite important. So when you're dealing with investigation that have multiple heads, you know, in a way, it's important to be able to have that process convergence.
And a lot of that, depending on what company you're with, some of those processes can be decentralized. So centralizing that within a corporation gives you a certain amount of security, that at least you have key essential personnel that as you start to brand that team or that department across your enterprise, that they know people to go to at the initiation of things, so that you can make sure that it's not the siloed approach and it doesn't come back later.
So both of you have touched on preservation and collections challenges, and that sort of leads into another topic here on finding key documents. So when you've preserved all this data, how are corporations actually finding the documents they need?
Yeah, so we asked, you know, who's responsible for finding key documents, and 45% of respondents said in-house resources are typically the ones responsible for finding it. For larger companies, it seems they rely on service providers and contract attorneys as well. Now, what methods are used to find key documents? There are two main methods: keyword searching, 30%, manual review, 28%. Non-US companies seem to prefer keyword search over manual review, according to the results.
Well, I think that there's a lot of, you have to marry best in breed tools. One approach to, you're asking an outside counsel who may have received some documents through self-collection, which has its challenges, to provide you something on, you know, 1 million records, to be able to identify how people are communicating. So again, if you are not retaining that information across investigations on how different business units, what is the nomenclature in which they use, and then putting that onus on outside counsel, search terms are only going to be effective if they're accurate. And they can be located, and that's the way people are communicating. But there are a number of different methodologies, and I think you have to go across that. There's also a lot of discussion about how we leverage AI and artificial intelligence, how we use those modules, especially for smaller cases, and it can be leveraged with thoughtfulness and with a keen eye to the people that are in-house in a team that's trained, or even with the maturation of using outside resources through the vendors that you use, that you can, for lack of a better word, augment that how you run that AI piece in order to deliver value back to what you are going to do. And you still need the surety that somebody who is a subject matter expert has reviewed the most key relevant information and categorized that. You can also leverage at a very low amount of spend overall. Instead of having outside counsel take first pass review, you can have your outside partner run with a team that you've built over for a number of years running first pass review that are going to punt up the first 1,500 documents that are going to be the most potentially responsible information. And if you start to train people in investigations, what do you use as a subject line that can be key essential searches that once you process that information, you know that you're going to get a 90 to 99% return on that investment when it goes to investigation, because those investigators know how they're going to be communicating regarding that, or how they attack business processes. So I will say that it is a lot of overlap and partnership across the enterprise, but I do think that you have to leverage all of the tools that are available to be effective.
Well, I agree. I think also we talked earlier about how it's identifying the right skills and the fact that there's an emergence of a need for technical skills to help. I also think clearly search is also a skill. That is, advanced search is a skill to identify. It's certainly an opportunity to reduce a good search, reduces costs and identifies documents faster, which is again often what you need with investigations. So those skills are very important, coupled with strong technology. And the technology, it's not just one technology that you need to use. It isn't a push the button kind of technology yet. The other thing that I think is interesting, and it makes sense that in-house resources would be utilized in investigations because they know the company, they know how people speak, etc. So if you couple that with searches that built in that intelligence, then I think you get better searching and better results. But there's no doubt that technology is going to take on more of a role now, I think, in dealing with data in the corporate environment. Would you say?
Yeah, I do think technology is going to play a major part, and with the investment of what type of technology you're going to have behind the firewall or in-house, that you can partner with your outside vendors, or you can give access or partner with your outside law firms. That type of technology and having a sound practice and the integrity of information, and then also the sampling. You have to, like you're talking about, that technologist position within companies is going to be, that data technologist position is going to be growing and growing and growing as we start to move in to the future, because that really is not just the practitioner on how to use that tool, but it's really how that information, and then where are your challenges with information as far as processing, exceptions, other things that are important, because a lot of times people process the information, but the exceptions are the last thing that they look at, and if you don't know, there could be anomalies in the processing tool that quite frankly keep essential key documents outside of that review corpus. So I think it's also that technologist is really explaining into a very basic sort of explanation what challenges you have, and making sure that you are looking at and vetting processes, because processes do break. And even if you have a tool where you have a very solid, hold in place or preservation or anything like that. You could have a system upgrade and you can suffer data loss and it's gone. So really what it is, and does it hold up to court scrutiny? I mean, that's really what we're here for, is does it hold up to court scrutiny? And can you say 9 times out of 10, can you have those kind of stats moving forward? So I think investment into that technology is mandatory as corporations move into this new age.
Just had another question come in about the types of analytics used during investigations. Do either of you have anything to say there?
Well, you're going to use artificial intelligence. There's a number of players out in the market. It depends on whether you're going with what we call disruptors in technology, where they might have it all built into one tool, where they're continuously actively learning and building that modules, or if you're going to do with some kind of integration between brain space and relativity, where you're going to take portions of review and run that. With any of the AI technologies, especially anything that are new to the market, that don't have the commercial presence, I would make sure that you have consistent quarterly vetting on any kind of irregularities in those tools. And again, you need somebody who can basically partner with that vendor, because you need complete transparency. It's not whether or not a problem exists, it's how you can approach that, and that relationship will be key and important. I would say that some of the traditional is the first model, where you're leveraging a tool like relativity and brain space, and they're talking to each other in that portion. There's a lot of different SaaS models where you can just upload metadata and then add in natives that you need to review that are going to reduce costs, and then run that model. And then you have a la carte, or all in one. You just need to make sure that you've vetted those and that you understand what their roadmap for development is, because as they release new functionality, it can sometimes be disruptive or cause errors in that model.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, TracyAnn. So we are at close to the end of our time. So on behalf of TracyAnn and Karla, thank you for your time today. We leave you with this takeaway, that as investigations are expected to increase, the survey indicates that companies need to be as proactive and efficient as possible. I also want to let you know that you can find materials at this link here, and we thank you for your time.